Please remember there are additional resources and things such as code samples at elithecomputerguy.com. So if you're watching one of these classes and you need to know what code looks like, or if you need links to the resources that we're using, please go to elithecomputerguy.com and take a look at our class posting there. Also, please remember that free to the end user classes are not actually free. It costs me a lot of money to be able to provide this type of content. So if you could click on the donate button and throw in a couple of dollars every month, this will help me be able to continue to provide you this type of material. Welcome back. As you know, I am Eli the Computer Guy, and today's class is Introduction to Python. So this is going to be the first in a series of many classes teaching you how to use the Python programming language in order to solve your problems. What's great about Python is you can use it to do any number of different tasks. So you can use it for managing your operating system, for interacting with databases, for building web applications, for building desktop applications, for double clicking and right clicking and that kind of thing, like a GUI interface type of deal. You can use it to create mobile apps. You can even use it to code for microcontrollers. So this is something called a Raspberry Pi Pico. And so what's really great with Python is basically you can use the same syntax to code for all of these different types of projects. One of the issues that we get into in the modern world with programming languages is that many times we learn multiple different programming languages to solve different problems. JavaScript for this issue, C for this issue, Python for this issue, PHP for this issue, so on and so forth. But the problem is that they all have their own syntax. They all have their own way of basically writing the code for it to function properly. And the issue is even if you're smart, you may be able to learn PHP and Python and C# and all these other different programming languages, but then trying to flip through all of these different programming languages as you're trying to build whatever project it is you're trying to build, it can get a little confusing. Is it else if or is it elif? Right? Do I use a semicolon as a delimiter, or do I use a space or a return as a delimiter? Oh crap, right? As you go through these different programming languages, it can be difficult to simply remember the syntax for the specific language that you're currently using. So one of the great things about Python is you can use this to develop so many different types of applications so that you can really understand a lot of concepts in the technology world. Python is my current go-to language, so anybody that's followed me for any length of time knows that PHP used to be my go-to language because that was a great, easy way for learning how to develop web applications. Python is currently my go-to language for students because, again, it may not be the perfect programming language for whatever project it is that you're doing, right? If you're actually trying to put something into a production environment, if you're actually trying to deliver something out to the world, Python might not actually be the best solution for you. But especially in a learning environment, when you're first trying to understand, like, what is an API? What is service-oriented architecture? What is a server? When you're trying to figure out all those kinds of things, one of the nice things with Python is you can just sit down. And again, you can go from interacting with the operating system to interacting with APIs to building web applications to doing all of these things with the same language base. You're not having to relearn a language, different languages over and over and over again. Then you can learn the concepts, and then you can say, oh, I developed this little app, this little project in Python is because it's what I know, but now I realize if I developed it in Node.js, it would scale better, have better performance, or that type of thing. And so that's an important thing to be thinking about, especially as a student, is in the technology world, right? The base layer that you need to get to is simply understanding what all this technology does. What is a TCP port? What is an IP address? What is a MAC address? Again, what is an API call? What is a REST API, right? Learning those base concepts is the most important thing when you're starting out. And then as you go, you learn which particular product or technology is best to solve particular problems. So what Python is great for is you can simply dive in, you can start playing with all of these things where at your scale, it's gonna work fine. And then as you become more of a professional, again, you may realize that the JavaScript world is a better world for you, or the C# world is a better world for you, but that'll be after you understand a lot more about the core components that are required in order to create projects. So what is Python as a programming language? The first thing to understand is that it's a scripted programming language, which means you have to have an interpreter installed upon your computer or device to be able to read the code that you've written to turn that into an application. So when we talk about interpreted programming languages, we talk about JavaScript, again, we talk about PHP, we talk about Python, Ruby on Rails. This is where you write all the code out as text. You basically give an extension of .php or .py or .js. You upload it onto your server, and then your server, again, has this interpreter installed onto that computer, which is able to read those text files that you've uploaded and turn that into code that does something for the end user. One of the nice things with Python is that this is basically installed on everything, including a potato. Right. So with a lot of the scripted programming languages, when they need interpreters, many times you'll actually have to install the interpreter onto the computer or device that you're going to be interacting with so that there is an interpreter to be able to read the code. Again, so if you're going to be creating a web server using PHP, you are almost always going to have to actually install PHP onto your computer that's going to be running those PHP scripts. The great thing about Python is it's on everything. When you install a fresh version of Ubuntu or Linux, it's going to have Python and it's on it. If you have a Mac OS, it's going to have Python on it. If you have a Windows OS, it's going to have Python on it. If you use some other weird OS, it is most likely going to have Python on it. Python will run on ARM. Python will run on x86 or x64 processors. Basically, again, once it gets a really complicated code, it gets a little bit more tricky. But for the projects that we're going to be doing in these classes and most projects that you're going to be interacting with, the great thing is you can just write Python code and it will simply run everywhere. And generally, you don't have to do a lot of configurations or mucking around with a computer in order to make it work. So that's one of the great things about Python. With Python, I'll show you a little bit of code later. One of the big things with Python is that it's easy to read. Again, I used to be a PHP fanboy. And again, I still have a little place in my heart for PHP. I gotta say, I like PHP. PHP is a dirt simple language to learn. That's actually relatively powerful, but I will give it to the quote unquote professional coders out there. You can make some ugly PHP code, right? So basically with PHP code, lines don't matter, spaces don't really matter. You can just write the code, and as long as you use semicolons are the delimiter in the PHP world, as long as you use semicolons correctly, your code will run. The issue that you run into is your code will run perfectly, but the person that has to come behind you to read your code, to do any kind of modifications or audit it, may not know what the hell you're doing, right? You could literally have a line of PHP code. We talk about like thousands of lines of code, like, oh, this script is 1,000 lines of code. Imagine instead of having 1,000 lines of code, you just had one line of code that contained the equivalent of 1,000 lines of characters, right? You can do that with PHP. You can break it into blocks. You can do all kinds of things. There's actually something called an obfuscation technique. So obfuscation is if you want to encrypt your data, right? So encrypting your data, basically what it does is you put your text or whatever through an encryption mechanism, and then out the side comes encrypted data that you cannot read. It is impossible to read without the key that allows you to decrypt the data, right? Well, sometimes you either can't or don't want to go all the way to the step of encrypting data, right? Especially if you're releasing open source like PHP code or JavaScript code. So you might want to do something called obfuscation. What obfuscation is basically where you don't encrypt the data, you just make it such a pain in the ass to read that all the data's there in plain text. It's just very difficult to read. There was something called a minify technique. So back when servers were a little less powerful than they are now, many times for JavaScript and other programming languages, you would use a script that would minify the script. And what that would do, it was rip out all of the additional white space that wasn't required in order for the script to run. And so you just have this block of text. Very fast, very efficient. You would not want to have to read it. And so basically, with that kind of mess, you get something called spaghetti code, a functional code that's damn near impossible to read. So one of the big things with Python when it was created is they wanted easy to read code actually built into the code, the scripting language, that it has to be easy to read. So with this, I'll show you the code a little bit later. You have indents and you have spacing within the code, and that's actually used as the delimiter for you. You're not going to use semicolons or anything like that. You're actually going to use indents for your code as the delimiter to make it a lot easier to be able to read your Python code. So not only is it functional, but it's also readable too. It was actually created back in 1991. I didn't realize this. Again, a lot of these languages that we think of kind of as modern today actually were created a long time ago. PHP was created in 1994. Python was actually created in 1991 in my world. So again, do you remember? Whenever you're listening to an instructor, understand where their bias is, understand where their lived experience is, understand where they come from when they start teaching you the technology to understand what they're trying to get across to you. So for me, again, I came from the systems world, MCSE from the year 2000, NT 4.0. And for me, Python became popular and it started becoming in the know somewhere around 2010. And this is really with the push to modern Web 3.0 standards, not Web 3. I hate our industry sometimes. Web 3 has something to do with blockchain and cryptocurrency and VR. Web 3 is the future. Just nobody can explain what it is. Web 3.0 is something else, right? So we had Web 1.0. Web 1.0 is essentially more or less static websites, maybe with JavaScript and CSS. You throw up a web page, and the web page is the web page. Then you get to Web 2.0. And so Web 2.0 is where you start getting dynamic web pages. So this is the world of like PHP, possibly Ruby on Rails. Essentially, you have a database back end, and then web pages are dynamically created based off of user input and what's in that database. Think about things like Yahoo's front page. Think about Friendster. Think about Facebook. Think about MySpace. These are kind of like Web 2.0 worlds where you're actually dealing with more of a web application than simply a web page. Now, the thing is, in the Web 2.0 world, that was all basically interacting with your own systems. And when I say your own systems, I mean Facebook's own systems or MySpace's own systems or Yahoo systems, right? So Yahoo, they would have their web servers, they would have their database systems, they would have their data stores, all of that kind of thing. And then you would use a language such as PHP or something else to go to the database that you own, to go to the data store that you own, to be able to dynamically build a page for you. Well, you get to about 2010 and we start getting to the world called service-oriented architecture. So again, back in the Web 2.0 world, we were still dealing very much with client-server architecture. You have a client computer, you have a server, basically they communicate back and forth. With a service-oriented architecture world, basically all these different services are provided by not just different servers, but entirely different vendors, right? So instead of using simply an email server, so again, back in like 2005, you have an Exchange server, maybe a Pigeon server, something like that. Once you get to 2010, you start having SendGrid servers. They're an API for being able to send out emails. You start having Twilio, an API for sending out SMS messages. All kinds of different APIs out there. Again, OpenAI now has an API for actually giving artificial intelligence. All these different things. And so in this world, PHP was no longer good enough because you actually had to have your server or your scripts now making API calls to Twilio, to SendGrid, to OpenAI, to all of these different service providers. And basically Python was the go-to language for doing those API calls. So again, about 2010, these different companies, whether it's Twitter, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Twilio, whether it's SendGrid, all these, they came out with these new APIs that allowed your application to be able to interact with the wider web. They required that you were using a programming language that they determined in order to be able to communicate with the API, and generally it was Python. And so from 2010 forward, you start to see more and more and more Python in the world because it was a good language for being able to communicate with all of these different services. It can communicate with your database, with your data store, with APIs, with all kinds of different things, pull in the information, push out the information.
and do what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So that's a basic idea of why Python is pretty cool and kind of where it came from. So I've kind of talked about this, before now, but we'll just rehash this again, basically on what can Python do for you. So one of the big ones, again, I'm a sysadmin, right? Infrastructure. If you want to be able to manage your infrastructure, Python is a great programming language. If you want to be able to replicate data between your servers, if you want to do backup routines, if you want to determine what the CPU usage is on different servers, and then be able to store that into a database, right? That's the type of stuff that you can do with Python. So basically interacting with the local operating system or being able to interact with remote systems actually at the command line level is the types of things you can do. Again, you can do file management if you want to do backup routines, that type of deal. You have database connectivity. So whether you're using MySQL, MariaDB, Postgres, MongoDB, any of these other database solutions, you can very easily connect Python into those databases in order to both read and write to those databases. So for infrastructure purposes, Python is really great. And we're going to have a lot of classes on showing you how to basically interact with your infrastructure using Python. Beyond that, if you want to do something like create a desktop application, so a lot of times when you look at Python, you look at command line level tools, DOS from my era, DOS, right? Basically, you get a blinking cursor, you run a script, you get some text out, right? That's great. That's great for real geeks. What about the not real geeks that actually just want to click a button or double click or right click? One of the cool things with Python is they actually have what are called desktop frameworks, such as tkinter. So with tkinter, what you can do is you can write out text. Basically in Python, you can write out all this code. When that Python script is run, you actually get a graphical user interface. So whatever, depending on what the code you wrote, you'll get a nice little dashboard. You'll have whatever buttons that you wrote into the code. When you click on those buttons, those will fire off whatever tasks that you've written them to do. And so basically you can create a full desktop application simply using Python. A web application. So this is a big thing in the modern world. Not just a website, right? Anybody can have a website. Don't you want a web application collecting people's information, doing things based off of that information, providing, customized web pages based on the user that's going to your site? That's one of the things that you can do with Python. There are frameworks out there. So Django is the one that I'm going to teach you a lot. I really like to focus on Django. That's a good framework for creating web applications. There's also Flask. There's also Fast API. Basically, with these frameworks, you're able to use Python to create web applications. And when I say web applications, you might be like, well, yeah, but I mean, Eli, how big? Eli, I might be the next Facebook. How big can you create a web application with Python? With Django, Instagram was actually originally created with Django. I think Pinterest is still uses Django to operate. So when we talk about web applications, you actually can scale this, up to Pinterest and Instagram level. You'll have to decide whether you think it'll be bigger than those. If you want to do mobile apps, I'll be honest. I'm honest with you here. You can use Python to do mobile apps. Again, basically the write once, deploy anywhere type thing. So think about like with React Native or Flutter. Those are other platforms that you can use in order to write code that you can then deploy to iOS applications or to Android applications, that type of thing. You can do that with Python. One of the frameworks that allows you to create mobile applications is a framework called Kivy, Kivy. I'll tell you it exists. If you want to really create mobile applications, I'd probably go the JavaScript route. But again, if you just want one programming language to be able to learn a lot of things, it is important to understand that you can actually do that with Python. Just be a little careful there. And then microcontrollers. Again, so this is a Raspberry Pi Pico. So if, Arduinos, right? You've heard of Arduinos, those microcontrollers. So the Raspberry Pi Pico is basically a different microcontroller. It just comes out from the Raspberry Pi Foundation, so the Arduino Foundation. You can actually use a MicroPython to code for these. So that's the great thing with Python is, again, look at all of these tasks and basically realize you can use the same syntax, you can use the same coding language to build for any of these solutions, and you really start to see why Python is a pretty cool language. So Python modules, this is kind of the core of what makes Python so flexible and so scalable, allows you to do so many amazing things. But it also is one of those things that makes Python an absolute pain in the ass when you're a newbie, right? Because if you go and you use different programming languages, a C or PHP or whatever, right, there are a lot of functions, core functions that are built into those programming languages. Again, just talking about PHP because that used to be the love of my life. But anyways, you go to PHP. If you want a random number, you can simply use the rand function just right out of the box. If you want to send emails, there's actually something called the mail function that comes right out of the box. If you need the time, a Unix timestamp, something like that, the function is built in right out of the box. It's amazing what you can do with PHP. So PHP also has additional modules that you're able to install into it to give more functionality. But straight out of the box, you can use plain vanilla PHP to do a tremendous number of things. Python, when you go to write the Python code, and I'll show you this, there's actually a script I'll show you in a little bit. When you go to write a Python code, initially, one of the things you have to remember is that every single function that you want to use in a Python script, you actually have to import that function. If you want a random number, so a rand int, that's what I'm going to show you in the script a little bit later. You actually have to import the random function and then call, or the random module, and then call the randint function from the random module in order to get a random number, right? Instead of simply being able to do rand whatever, you have to do import random, and then you have to do random.randint blah, right? If you need time, if you want your code to sleep, right? If you want your code to pause for 1 second or 2 seconds, you have to import the time module and then call the sleep function. Now, when you first start dealing with this, it's very frustrating. Again, anything that you want to do other than like print, you can print straight out of the box. Everything else, you're going to be importing these modules into the script. Initially, it seems like a real pain in the ass. Well, you learn about the Python modules. What makes them good is it actually makes Python more secure than other programming languages such as PHP, right? Since PHP has all of those built-in functions, if a hacker is able to manipulate your code somehow, they then have access to all of those built-in functions to cause havoc on your infrastructure. One of the nice things with Python scripts is literally if you don't install the modules or the functions, even if a hacker is able to compromise your script somehow, it does not have the ability to do whatever it is that they're trying to do. The other thing that's great with Python is basically it was built, or at least it is at this point in time, it's a language that the open source community has really come around to support. So if you're trying to do anything in the Python world, there's going to be a Python module out there that will allow you to do exactly what it is that you're trying to do. Why that's nice with this whole module system is, let's say previously you had a module in your script in order to do something, send an email or whatever else. And then basically later you find a better module. So it may do the exact same task, but it does it more efficiently, something like that. It allows you to very easily swap and basically change out those modules within your script without necessarily having to do a lot of code rewrite. So that's one of the useful things. Again, we're going to get into this a lot with the different classes that are coming up, but just realize when you go to write Python scripts for the first time and you're used to other programming languages, if you can't get a random number, if you can't figure out how to make the script pause or do some of these very, very, very basic things, most likely what you need to do is you need to import a module that has the function built into it so that you can then call the function and go about it that way. So anyways, most of the functionality is actually within these modules, which is, again, at the end of the day, a good thing, but when you're brand new, it can be very, very frustrating. Now let's take a moment to talk about Python frameworks, right? So Python, the programming language, can do all of these amazing things. You can create desktop applications and web applications and mobile applications and develop for microcontrollers and all those types of things. All you have to do is use a specific framework and you'll be good to go. Now, one of the issues you run into is like for me, when I was first learning Python, I didn't really understand modules. And so I kind of thought frameworks were just kind of like a module. Like, oh, module's pretty simple. Import sleep or import time and then do time dot sleep and then have the code sleep for a couple of seconds like that. Okay, that's going to be pretty easy. So when I went out to build desktop applications initially or to build web applications initially, I thought it was going to be relatively easy. It was like, I know Python. I know how to do, for X loops, and I know how to do if else, elif statements. Basically, I just have to learn, a little bit of different syntax in order to be able to create these desktop applications or these web applications. It's going to be super simple. Yeah. Frameworks can actually be more complicated to learn than Python itself. Again, so the Python coding language, again, is overall relatively simple to learn. You'll be able to learn it in 40 hours. Then you're going to be like, wow, I know Python. So you're going to want to learn how to build web applications or desktop applications or whatever else. You're going to learn, oh, okay, there's this framework that's out there that allows me to build that type of application. I'm just going to install that framework. And, how long is it going to take to learn? Could be long time. It could be long time. For any of these frameworks that you're going to use, many times I will just warn you that they can actually be more complicated to learn than Python initially itself. The Python programming language can be dirt simple. The frameworks can be pretty complicated. Again, Django, I have learned to love Django. But that was a painful honeymoon period. Because with Django, when you're building the web applications, there's this MVC. Anyways, whatever. We will go over these in different classes. And again, we're actually we're going to have a full series on Django, and we're going to have a full series on tkinter. The main thing that I just want you to realize is if you go down the route where you're going to need a framework, make sure you give yourself a week to learn that framework before you have to deliver anything to your boss, because these are going to be much more complicated than you realize. So now let's take a moment to actually talk about the Python syntax. Now what I'm going to show you is a very, very, very simple script. I just want you to start to get an idea of what the Python syntax looks like. If we go over, I have this class script right here. Let me shrink this a little bit. And basically with this class script, what we're going to do is we're going to create a random number. We are then going to print a random number 10 different times, and every time we print the number, if the random number is over 50, we're going to print random number is big. So just to give you an idea of what this looks like, basically if I hit the run button up here, we can see that it says 73 is big, 46, 83 is big, 24, and 89 is big, 11, no, 36, no, right? So this is basically all we're going to be doing. We're going to be creating a random number 10 times, and then if that random number is over 50, we're going to print the random number and is big right beside it, and if it's under 50, we're just going to print the number. Pretty simple script, but again, it starts to give you an idea of what the syntax in the Python world looks like. So again, the first thing that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to import the random number. So simply to get a random integer, we have to import the random module, and then we're going to call the randint function, right? So if we don't do this, we're not going to be able to get a random int. So we're going to import random. Here, we're simply going to do x equals 0. So again, x is a variable name. We're just going to have it be 0. And so basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looping 10 times here. So we do x equals 0, and then x plus equals 1 down here. So it starts as 0, goes 1, 2, 3, 4, keeps looping through, right? Then here, this is a while loop. So you notice there's no additional parentheses or anything like that. So while x is less than or equal to 10, so x is currently 0, while it's less than or equal to 10, then we do colon. Then what we can see here is I tab in. Now supposedly you're supposed to space in. Have you ever seen that Silicon Valley show? There's a HBO show called Silicon Valley. And at one point during the show, like the main guy, the main geeky guy, the startup founder is getting it on with this geeky girl. And then they start having this conversation about spaces versus tabs. This is what that conversation was about. And he ended up not getting laid that night because she used spaces and he used tabs, or vice versa. Just this is what you're doing here. So basically you do the while. So if it's an if, you tab or space in or a while. So basically here's the conditional, it's tabbed in. Here's the if statement, tab in. Here's the else, tab in. So this can either be a space or a tab, but you need this. So while, then you come in. So random num equals the random module dot rand int between 0 to 100. If random num is greater than 50, colon, print, this is called an F string. We'll talk about this later. Basically, print the value of random number and then is big. Else, print just the random number, x plus equals 1. So x plus 1 equals what the results are, and then it loops through. And so this is a basic idea of what the Python syntax looks like. Now there is a style guide. So when you get into the Python world, again, one of the issues you run into with coding is that you can write something that's functional, but if other people can't read it, it can be a pain in the butt. So there is a style guide that was originally created back in 2001, got updated in 2013. It's called PEP 8. And so basically with PEP 8 here, you can go through and you can see how they think you should style when you're writing the code. So correct. If you're having a long basically, if you have like a long function here, they show you basically these are the correct ways to put that the function or whatever on different lines. These are the wrong ways of doing it. If you scroll down, whether or not to use spaces, whether or not to use tabs, maximum line length. Basically, if you go through PEP 8, what you're going to see is this is a style guide. So basically the style of how they believe Python should look. Whether or not you agree with it, it probably is a good thing for you to look over, especially as a new coder. Again, it's that whole thing, right? In order to play, in order to experiment, sometimes you have to be really good. Like Picasso was a really good artist, and then he was able to play and do some really interesting, cool things, right? That's one thing to be thinking about with kind of like styling with Python or any other language. Learn how the old timers think you should style the language, and then become an artist with how you're doing it. That's one of the things to kind of consider. But anyways, yeah, if you come through here, there's PEP 8, and there's all kind. Again, spaces, the correct way of doing things, the wrong way of doing things, correct way, wrong way, blase, blase, blase. And so this can be a useful thing, again, if you're learning Python on your own, to make your code look a little bit more professional. Even if it functions perfectly with how you're doing it. So anyways, that's basically, just a little example of what the Python syntax looks like, kind of how the white spaces, those lines work, how modules work, and then the PEP 8, the syntax guide or the style guide. So if you're getting really excited right now about Python, the first question you're going to ask is, wow, how can I start writing Python code? What do I need to buy? Well, if you're watching this on YouTube or another video player, hopefully you already have a computer or a very powerful potato. And so that's basically all you need to buy, right? You just need a computer in order to be able to write Python. So I do in-person classes here in Asheville, North Carolina, and literally the lab computers that we use are 2012 MacBook Pros. So I am recording this at the end of 2023. So those computers are at very least 11 years old, maybe closer to 12 years old at this point, and you can code in Python and run most things in Python just fine. Even things like computer vision. So we're going to have classes on OpenCV. OpenCV is a computer vision framework. Even OpenCV, gets the point across. We'll just say it gets the point across. So you truly do not need a super powerful computer in order to run most Python code. Almost any Python code will run on an old netbook if you had it. Once you start getting into machine vision, that kind of stuff, you'll need something a little bit more powerful. So basically, you just need a basic computer, and then you use VS Code. So here, everything that I'm going to show you, we're generally going to be using VS Code. VS Code is free from Microsoft. This is one of the greatest things that Microsoft has produced, frankly, in the past 40 years. Basically, this is a nice IDE that allows you to write code. Beyond that, you then have extensions. So with this, you'll notice like import. So this is blue, X equals this is green, right? So in order to get this coloring in here, basically all you do is you add an extension. So there's this extensions here. And what extension are we going to use? This is a lot bigger than it normally is. So for once you start writing, it's Python. Anyway, so let me shrink this down. So you have this Python extension that you add to VS Code, and once you add this to VS Code, that's what gives you, the color coding, the IntelliSense, all of the additional information that allows you to be able to write Python relatively easily. Now, to be clear, you can use Notepad. To be crystal clear, you can use Notepad in order to code in Python. Yes, you can, but I would argue VS Code. It runs on Windows, obviously. It runs on Mac, obviously, because I'm doing it. It runs on Ubuntu very well. Basically, it runs on almost every single operating system out there. Again, whether you're using x86 or ARM processors, it's free. Again, there's no weird fees that you have to pay, anything like that. It's just an absolutely great IDE. There are other IDEs out there that may be specific for the Python programming language. You would have to decide whether or not you want to go down that route. Because one of the nice things with like VS Code is I can use VS Code to write Python and JavaScript and CSS and, the different programming languages that I have to use in order to actually make an application work. I can write all of that in VS Code just fine, again, with adding some of these extensions. So I would argue VS Code is the best way to go. So let's take a moment to talk about versions in the Python world, right? So we write the Python code, right? We write that out essentially in a text file that simply has a .py extension. We upload to that server, and then the interpreter will read that code and produce some type of output. Now, do realize that interpreter is an application, just like Word is an application, just like Firefox is an application, or Exchange is an application, right? And so there are different versions of that application. And so depending on what you're trying to accomplish, you may need to make sure that the version of Python that you're using is at the level that it's supposed to be. So if you're using, let's say, OpenAI, I think you're supposed to be using at least a Python version like 3.1 at this point. If you're using an earlier version of Python, it may not work properly. Don't worry, all you have to do is update, and Python should get updated to whatever the latest version is. So generally, when you're in the Python 3 world, worst case scenario, you just update your Python and everything should run well. The issue that you might run into, lordy help you, is that there is the version 2 of Python. Right, so version 2 of Python, I think, came out in 2000. So there was the original version of Python, came out in 1991. Then they came out with the version 2 of Python that came out in 2000. And they were going along with version 2 of Python. And then they just got to a point where they realized, well, they had made a lot of bad decisions. Right? Because again, one of the things you have to think about, like with any application, with anything in the technology world, right? People, humans, are building this stuff. And sometimes you don't build your foundation, to the quality that you should have built the foundation. And then you start building this huge tech stack up, and you realize your foundation is kind of crap. And at a certain point, as your project keeps going and going and going and going, you realize you kind of need to stop, erase a lot of things, and start over again. And so that's what they had between version 2 and version 3 of Python. So version 2 of Python, it was running. They realized we went down a bad route. we want to change some things. So they went to version 3, and this was basically a hard fork of the language. If you write Python basically based off of version 2 syntax and try to run it on a Python 3 interpreter, there's a good chance it will fail. There are ways to try to make it work, but it is very different. So like, again, PHP, my old coding love that I used to use, right? With PHP, basically, certain functions would get deprecated, certain functions would get added, certain functions would get deprecated or taken out. But basically, PHP is PHP. You have PHP 1. From PHP 1, I don't know what they're up to now, 8 or 9. Basically, it's a continuum. So even if you write based off of the current PHP 9 standards, if you have a 3 interpreter or 4 interpreter, I learned on PHP 4, if you have a 4 interpreter out there, most likely your code will run on that 4 interpreter, unless you're trying to do something very sophisticated. It is important to understand that is not the same here. If you write in 3 and for some reason you only have the 2 interpreter installed on your system, that 3 Python code will not run properly. If you write in Python 2 and try to run in a Python 3 interpreter, that will not run properly. So basically, version 2 is, think of it almost as an entirely different programming language versus version 3. You'll get into this, especially with Ubuntu, or possibly Linux distributions, because they'll come with both interpreters, both the 2 interpreter and the 3 interpreter. And so you will notice when we go to run a script, so you can run a script from the command line. Many times if you run a version 2 script, you'll do Python and then whatever that script name is to run the script. If you're using a version 3 script, you may do Python 3 space whatever the script is in order to run the script. And so again, that's one of the frustrating things in the Python world. Like once you realize it, it's easy, it's no big deal. You just write Python 3, type Python 3, it'll work properly. But you might run into issues where you write some pretty simple Python script, you do Python space whatever the script is, and it fails out. And the reason is because the Python 2 interpreter is trying to run a Python 3 script. Now, what I will tell you is in January 2020, all support finally stopped for version 2. So version 2 support was supposed to stop in like 2010. And then the way the technology industry is, it went to 2012 and like 2016. Finally, in 2020, they were like, stop, we're done. We're not going to support it anymore. So one of the issues you may run into if you're going into a legacy infrastructure is you may still have version 2 scripts running within your infrastructure. Again, you know, if it's doing database replication, if it's doing backup routines, doing some kind of like those maintenance type tasks, you may still have 2 scripts running within your infrastructure. The important thing to realize is that that is no longer supported, and that 2 interpreter may have some major security flaws in it by this point. And the other thing to be thinking about is if you go, oh, look, this is a little replication script, I just want to make a couple of modifications. If you open it up and it's a version 2 script and you start writing version 3 code, when you go to run it in the future, everything may fail out. The other thing to be thinking about, again, between version 2 and 3, especially if you're new, be careful when you go to Amazon and you buy, dummies, Python for Dummies books or anything like that. Like that's one of the cool ways to learn, different technologies, is you can go and you can buy, programming cookbooks or dummies books or anything like that in order to build projects. I ran into this problem when I was learning Raspberry Pi. So a couple of years ago, when I was first learning Raspberry Pi, I wanted to learn how to do scripting in Python with the Raspberry Pi. I bought a Python for Raspberry Pi for Dummies books, and it was version 2. So basically I got it and it went straight in the trash. So again, those are just some of the things to be thinking about. Generally, you shouldn't have to worry about version 2. If we lived in a sane world, if we lived in a sane world, 2 would not even matter. But we do not live in a sane world, so do be careful about 2. So who is Python for? Now, one of the things I used to talk about with PHP when I did classes for PHP is I thought it was a great language because initially the idea with PHP was that it was going to be a language that secretaries were going to be able to use in order to automate systems within an office environment, right? HTML was so easy to learn. CSS was so easy to learn. There was this idea, what if just rank and file secretaries were able to learn a coding language language and be able to develop, applications to make their lives easier and to make processes within their corporation more efficient. Wouldn't that be great? And then we got to the real world. And what we found out is, yes, secretaries can learn to code. But when secretaries start coding applications, how do you deal with maintenance of said applications? What happens when the secretary leaves and nobody knows what the password is for that particular server? Again, if you think an IT environment of professional geeks is a disaster, just imagine, again, when your average secretary is actually writing code. Again, writing the code is not the bad part. The interesting thing then comes up is with Python. So who is Python for? One of the things that I think is great with Python is that basically Python is kind of like the next iteration of PHP, where it really can be for anybody. So again, for geeks, for IT professionals, for real programmers, you can obviously use Python to create all these amazing applications. But one of the interesting things that we've started to see with Python in the modern world is that a lot of scientists are now using Python because there are a lot of modules in Python that allow you to do with like statistics and higher level math. And basically, we have these massive data sets that are now available. And so if you're a scientist, you may be I don't know, a pharmaceutical scientist or whatever else, and you're trying to determine the results of an experiment. Well, we're getting more and more data every day, right? Silicon Valley, the tech industry is like more data, more data, more data. There is never enough data. And so one of the problems you get into is you get scientists or you get other professionals, and then they just get a lot of data. They just get a lot of data, right? I mean, they know what every column means. They understand the basic concept of what is stored within the data. But again, if you give to a scientist 10 records, they can look at 10 records and they can figure out what's going on from like a database or something. You give them 100 records. Maybe they have to create a macro or something in Excel, but they'll be able to figure it, be able to pull out some correlations. What happens in the modern world? We're so fixated on data. When you give a scientist or an engineer 1 million records. Like, oh, you want the results of the experiment? Well, it's not thumb. It's a thumb drive. Here's a thumb drive. There's 10 million records on it. Figure out what the correlations are. Right? So one of the nice things with Python is, again, in a very simple script, right? A script, something like this. What you could do is you could open up a file, or you could connect to a database, and then you could write, if else statements or whatever else to pull out specific information from that database, test it against different values that you have, and then actually print out a result that might be useful for you. So one of the great things about Python is, again, that this is not simply a language for quote unquote tech professionals. Really, I think it's a valuable language for any kind of professional that needs to be able to gain value out of these records, this information that they're being able to get. When I was doing the in-person classes here in Asheville, I actually had a couple of students, and I'll be like, "Oh, are you tech professionals or whatever else?" And GIS, Geographic Information Systems, so basically like mapping services. I actually had a number of folks who their job was like GIS, understanding maps and terrain features and all that kind of stuff. And they actually came to learn better how to pull information out of those maps in order to do their job. So they weren't building Django apps or Tkinter apps or anything like that. They were just learning how to parse data for value. So Python really is, and basically for almost anybody, it is an easy language to learn that basically will run on damn near anything. You can write it in VS Code, right, which is free. And so really there's almost no downside to learning Python. And so the final thoughts, we've kind of taken you through what Python is. So it's an interpreted language. Basically, the interpreters are on darn near anything at this point. Everything from servers to desktop computers to the potato that's sitting in your oven right now, right? Anything that runs an operating system most likely has a Python 3 interpreter installed. You're able to write Python 3 code and basically be able to have it run. Again, with Python, you can build any number of different types of projects. anything from simply parsing data to desktop applications to web applications to mobile applications, the whole 9 yards. In order to create all of those different types of applications, you're going to have to use a framework. So a framework is tkinter, a framework is Django, a framework is Kivy. The thing to realize is many times those frameworks are actually more difficult to learn than Python, right? You understand the basic Python syntax, but then learning the framework, that can be its own disaster. And the main reason I put that on the table is, again, if you're going to build a project for your organization or company, or build like some kind of school project, just give yourself enough time. If you're like, man, I already know Python, this is going to be easy, and then you jump into Django, well, it's gonna take you a little bit of time, so just kind of keep that in mind. Again, there's modules. So modules are very useful because, again, you can swap out for specific functionality. It actually also makes the code more secure. So if a hacker is able to compromise your code, they can't necessarily do the same things they could if they were able to compromise PHP or whatever. But just realize with that, you're going to have to actually add import the modules, import functions. There's a whole process to do that. And so if you're just writing a Python script and literally all you want is a random number, just realize it may take a couple more lines of code than you're expecting on that. Again, with the versions, version 3, which is the version that you should be using, they have versions just like any other application, version 3, version 3.1, version 3.11, the whole 9 yards. Most of the time, that's probably not going to come up for you unless you're using a specific API, something like that. You may have to have a very specific version of Python on your system, but that's its own deal. Really, just update your system, you'll be fine. The big difference, though, is between version 2 and version 3. Do remember that was a hard fork. So version 2, you should consider version 2 essentially an entirely different language than version 3. Don't buy the version 2 books. Don't learn the version 2. But if you run into version 2 in the real world, be careful you don't do something stupid. Again, you may just do a couple of modifications on version 2 code with the version 3 syntax that you know, and everything might go to hell. Again, with Python, it's literally designed to be a readable programming language. So not only should your code function, but people should be able to read it. Not only is there the syntax, though, but there is that PEP 8 style guide. Whether you want to go with that PEP 8 style guide is kind of your own decision. And again, Python is a great programming language, literally for anybody, right? You hear this in the modern world, quote unquote, everybody should learn to program. Not everybody needs to know how bank accounts work. Not everybody needs to know how their 401k works. Not everybody needs to be able to eat healthy. Anyways, but everybody needs to learn how to code. Sorry, my pet peeves coming out with our modern education system. It's amazing what we're told everybody needs to know. And then there's all this other stuff that you don't need to know how to eat healthy, but you do need to learn how to code. Anyway, if you do want to learn how to code, understand how functions work, if-else statements, all these kinds of things, again, Python is a really simple, generally easy way to learn how to code. And if you're interested to get into the tech field, this is a good way to go, right? You can sit down, you can start literally learning Python today. You can spend a week learning Python. If at the end of the week, you're pretty excited, you're pretty happy, you're like, yeah, this is not god-awful, then you might want to keep learning more Python and learning more about technology. If you get to the end of the week and you think, I am absolutely miserable and can't imagine doing this for 8 hours a day, well, then you may want to go off and be a florist or a baker, basically do something else in life. Again, I am one of those tech people that does not believe everybody in the world needs to be a technology professional. As a technology professional, I like going to restaurants where chefs serve me food. I like getting my car fixed at places that know how to fix my car. I like driving down roads with asphalt on them. Again, to be clear, not everybody needs to be a coder. But again, that might be getting into my pet peeves at this point. So anyways, again, this is the first in a long series of classes. So we're going to be doing basically an introduction to Python series. And so that's going to be a block of classes. And then we're also going to have projects. And then we're also going to have side series. So again, like a series on Django, a series on tkinter, a series on these other pretty cool things that you can do in the Python world. So I'll just keep popping these classes out. So let's see. I enjoyed doing this particular class, and look forward to seeing you at the next one.